Hello and welcome to By the Book. I'm your host, Joe Hebert. Today we continue our course on truth, justice, and leadership with the study of Tocqueville's Democracy in America. In previous episodes, we talked about Tocqueville's views on science and particularly his contrast between the classical notion of science, which is contemplative, and the modern notion, which is utilitarian. And we talked about his views on classical literature versus modern literature. That the classics tend to be written for connoisseurs and trying to go into tremendous depth and detail to understand the nature of things related to that contemplative approach. Whereas modern literature, again, relatedly tends to be more utilitarian in this sense, entertaining or informing, but sort of being produced at a high volume with less attention to detail. And in both cases, we saw that Tocqueville he's not endorsing the whole package of ancient society with all of its strengths and weaknesses, but he is pointing out that essentially the contemplative nature of science is part of human nature and is essential for us. And also that this love of detail and truth that is reflected in classical literature is something that we need as human beings. So we don't want to lose these things in the modern world. And finally, we looked at his views on self-interest and how he sees that there is basically an uncontrolled kind of destructive self-interest in the modern world, which he looks at, especially in Europe and France. There's a more well-regulated, what he calls interest well understood, that he sees in America, where people realize that it is in their own interests to be good citizens, to be good neighbors, to be good people. But he still argues that this falls short of human nature because by nature we have a natural desire to actually do good for its own sake. We certainly don't always do that any more than we do everything else that we're naturally capable of doing. But it's a part of human nature that he argues is essential. And he traces that all the way through to religion, saying that religion could be useful as an extension of interest well understood. In other words, I want to be rewarded in the next life for doing good in this life. But there's an even higher meaning to religion, which is that it captures the part of us that simply desires to know and to love and to do what is actually true and good. And this is ultimately, God himself is the epitome of this. So this is the highest motive in religion. So we're seeing the pattern here that Tocqueville is looking at the higher things, the higher desires, that we have desires that go beyond the desires that Machiavelli talked about for wealth or power or glory. We have a desire actually for what is true, good, and beautiful. And this comes up repeatedly in Tocqueville's assessments of different aspects of modern democratic life. So today we're going to talk about Tocqueville's views on materialism. And just to begin with, I want to point out that there's a distinction that Tocqueville makes between two different meanings of the word materialism. One of them would be philosophical, that is believing that only matter exists and that there is no spiritual reality, that these things are epiphenomena, they're not real. And the other meaning of materialism is a habit of giving preference or priority to material things. So in other words, my life is devoted to the acquisition of material goods or the enjoyment of material goods or some combination of those. And those are obviously related. If I believe that matter is all that exists, then it would tend to encourage me to focus on that. If I believe there's something beyond matter, then presumably I would want to spend some time on that. But it doesn't necessarily go together. I can believe that there are higher goods, but I don't really get the gumption to go after them. So it's an important distinction. He's not saying that, for example, Americans are all materialists in the philosophical sense, or modern people are going to be materialists in the philosophical sense. But he does, as we see in chapter 10 here, he's focusing on the taste for material well-being. That is the prioritization of material goods as within the economy of our lives as a whole. So the first thing he has to say about it, in America, the passion for material well-being is not always exclusive, but it is general. In other words, you ask people, what do you care about? They're not going to say, oh, just material goods. But he says, generally, that is almost everywhere, you can see that people are highly prioritizing material goods. If everyone does not experience it in the same way, everyone feels it. So there's variations, there's different degrees, different expressions of it. But he's saying almost everywhere you look, you're seeing it in America. The concern to satisfy the slightest needs of the body and to provide for the smallest conveniences of life preoccupies the mind universally. So there's two big things about that last sentence there that I think are really crucial. One is you can see that what Tocqueville is doing operationally is he's using the classical notion of the golden mean. That is, he's assuming, this is not a textbook on ethics, so he's not really spelling this out for us, but he is assuming that the goal in practical affairs is to achieve the golden mean. And we're going to look at in more depth at that when we get to Plato, but just for now, I want to reiterate that the basic logic of the golden mean is simply that most of the things that we deal with, including material goods, are not ends in themselves. They're means to some other good that we're trying to accomplish. And so if we are using them properly, we're measuring them according to the means. So if I'm looking at, I want to drink water every day, that's good. If I don't do that, I could be dead. But if I'm thinking I'm going to drink a swimming pool full of water today, that's not going to be good for me, right? So if there's an objective good that I'm aiming at, it puts a limit on what I need. And so moderation is built into the logic of objective goodness. If there's an objective good, there's objective criteria, objective measurements that have to be applied. And with material goods, goods of the body, Tocqueville is implying that's the case. So when people are concerned about the slightest needs of the body, it's a kind of intrinsically off track, right? That's giving too much concern for the body. Now, why is that? We'll see in a little bit why he makes that judgment. But here we could see that his argument is not we should just ignore the body, we should neglect the body. His argument is that we should aim at a golden mean, that we should understand what is the actual objective goodness that's involved in taking care of the body, and we should focus on that and not go beyond it. And the other part is the preoccupation, because what we're going to see is the reason that this is important, that we need to moderate our concern for the body, is because it displaces something else. There's something else that we should be concerned about, something else that we should be spending time on. And the more time we spend on the body, the less time we have for this other thing. And that's the reason why it's particularly important to moderate the concern for the body. So as usual, Tocqueville does a contrast between the old societies, the aristocratic societies, and the new democratic societies. So to begin, we'll begin with the old. Among nations where aristocracy dominates society and keeps it immobile, again, he means that people are pretty much locked into their social status, that they're not moving up and down in society for the most part. The people end by becoming accustomed to poverty as the rich are to their opulence. So because society is immobile, if you're rich, you're going to stay rich. If you're poor, you're going to stay poor. There's very few exceptions. So what does this do to people's relationship to material things? The latter, that is the poor, are not preoccupied by material well-being because this is the rich, because they possess it without difficulty. So this is an important concept to grasp because especially in a democratic society, we would tend to associate the rich as people who care about money. There's a reason for that, which we'll get to in a minute. But in the aristocratic societies, it's virtually the opposite. Not always, but on the whole, it's more the opposite. Because and Tocqueville is explaining the reason, because if you're rich, if your wealth is something that you inherit and that you're always going to have, you can't really lose it according to the rules of society, then you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to think about it. It's something you take for granted. And so you're free to then focus your energy on other things. You have the money, you don't have to worry about that. So now you're going to think about what else can I do with my life? But what about the other side, the side of the poor? The poor, do not think about material well-being because they despair of gaining it and do not know it well enough to desire it. So they can see it maybe, when they see the lords going back and forth, but it's not something that they ever thought was for them. So they also are not preoccupied by it. So you notice that there's something wrong here. There's an injustice. There's an unjust inequality in society. But on the other hand, there's a certain advantage even on both sides of this, because people are free to think and care about other things, which, as we'll see in a minute, is very important in Tocqueville's view. But what happens in a democratic society? There's the good side is people are free to actually pursue careers and other aspirations that they have. They're not being held down artificially. And when it comes to materialism, there's an issue that emerges, and here's why. When, on the contrary, ranks are mingled and privileges destroyed, when patrimony is divided and enlightenment and liberty spread, the desire to gain well-being occurs to the imagination of the poor, and the fear of losing it to the mind of the rich. So both sides are deeply affected by this. Those who are rich suddenly realize, in a dynamic society, my wealth is not guaranteed to me. I can lose it. So the rich have to maintain a focus on wealth if they want to keep it. So that's what I was saying before. We tend to think about the rich as people who are devoted to money. In the old world, that was usually not the case. But in the modern world, it usually is, because the dynamics of our society mean that you're not going to have a lot of money for a long time unless you're heavily focused on it. But on the other hand, those who don't have money, they know they have an opportunity. They know it's possible to get money. So even though they don't have the money, they're still thinking about it. They're thinking about how to get it. So everybody's thinking about money now, because they're either going to get it or lose it. And they have to think about that. A multitude of mediocre fortunes is established. So, most people end up somewhere in the middle, right? So you have a growing middle class overall, because everybody's trying to get as much as they can. And there's going to be a bell curve there, but most people are in the middle. Those who possess them have enough material enjoyments to conceive the taste for these enjoyments, and not enough to be content with them. So, wherever we are exactly on that bell curve, there's always more we could have. For some of us, there's a lot more we could have. For others, there's less to aim at, but there's always something more we can have materially. So in this kind of society, it's maximizing the degree to which we think about and worry about this, because we always know that whatever we have, it's less than what we could have. Plus, we could always lose what we have too. So even if we happen to be fairly content with it, we can't rest content because we could lose it. They never obtain these enjoyments except with the effort, and devote themselves to them only with trepidation. So you could see where Tocqueville is going with this. On the one hand, this is the American dream. This is the great opportunity that everybody has. But Tocqueville's saying, wait a minute, it also produces a ceaseless anxiety for virtually everybody, because everybody's either thinking, I'm going to lose what I have, or I don't have enough, I need more. And so, people are never content with what they have in such a society. So we can already see that this was not what Machiavelli promised, right? Machiavelli was saying that people are going to be satisfied with material things. And just on the plane of material things alone, Tocqueville is saying, actually, they're very anxiety-inducing. That focus on material things, it induces anxiety. But in the next chapter, Why Certain Americans Exhibit So Exalted a Spiritualism, he goes a major step further than that. It's not just that we become anxious about these material goods, but it's that we have other desires that are being neglected when we focus on those things. So let's take a look at this. Although the desire to acquire the goods of this world is the dominant passion of the Americans, there are moments of respite when their soul seems suddenly to break the material bonds that hold it and to escape impetuously toward heaven. So two things here. One is that Tocqueville is using some language that shows that this is an escape. So there, material things are, in a sense, are kind of a trap. They are holding us back because there's a part of us that wants to soar higher than material goods. And so to the extent we are obsessed with them, we are not fulfilling our potential as human beings, and we can feel that. So it's a sense of liberation when we can look beyond material goods. On the other hand, the way he's describing it here is that their impetuosity, for example, there's a kind of desperation in this chapter when he describes the excited spiritualism. We'll see he's not a fan of the excited spiritualism. This is not the way to correct the problem. A little bit later in our next episode, we're going to look at the more positive example of how do you, in a healthy way, how do you try to supply the what's lacking. But here he's looking at more of like the desperate measures that people take when they just aren't satisfied with their lives, but they don't really know what to do. So they just try to all of a sudden break away and rush towards heaven without necessarily having a plan for how to do that. So what happens when you try to do something that you're not really good at or you don't have a plan for? You find here and there within American society some souls totally filled with an excited and almost fierce spiritualism that you hardly find in Europe. From time to time, bizarre sects arise there that try hard to open extraordinary paths to eternal happiness. Religious madness is very common there. So Tocqueville's not hiding his views on this, right? He's not a fan. He's not a fan of bizarre, spiritual sects, religious madness, and things like this. So a big part of the point here is that, again, if you're doing something out of desperation, you're doing something because you have been obsessed with other stuff and you never really figured out how to do the other thing, in this case, how to go beyond material things. When you do it, you're probably going to do it in an ineffective manner, and that's what he's observing here. But the lesson that I want to focus on here is his explanation of why does this happen. Because again, we're going to see a little bit later what's a better way to address this problem. But for now, it's not the solution that we're looking at, is the nature of the problem. And this is what's really crucial. He says, this must not surprise us. In other words, if we knew human nature, if we knew human society well, we could have predicted this. Why? Because man has not given himself the taste for the infinite and the love of what is immortal. So in other words, spiritual things, religious things, these aren't, something that's been tacked on to society. He says these sublime instincts do not arise from a caprice of the will. They have their unchanging foundation in his nature. They exist despite his efforts. So just like he has done before, Tocqueville comes back again to human nature and he says human nature is not what Machiavelli said it is. It is not simply material, focused on material goods and competitive goods. It is focused on things like, he said before, knowledge, science. It is focused on the good, doing good. Here he says it's focused on the love of what is immortal, so the infinite and the immortal. Okay, and this is despite our efforts. In other words, we can't suppress it. No matter how addicted we get to material things, there's a part of us that says, I want something beyond that. I want something immortal. I want something infinite. So he can hinder and deform these tastes, but he cannot destroy them. The soul has needs that must be satisfied. And I'm going to stop here for a minute because this is one of the more important statements in this whole book. The soul has needs that must be satisfied. Now, what is the soul? We went through Machiavelli's Prince without even mentioning the soul because Machiavelli never mentions the soul in that book. And that is one of the most important things about Machiavelli's Prince. It's one of the very few books on ethics and politics. At that time when he published it, one of the very few books that goes through a comprehensive view of ethics and politics without mentioning the soul. Because as we'll see, the soul is the central focus of classical thought on ethics and politics. So the soul is a fairly complex concept when you look at all of its different permutations. At the most basic level, the soul is the thing that makes us alive rather than dead. So the difference between a living human being and a corpse, that maybe died a few seconds ago, is the soul is there animating, and anima is the Latin word for soul, animating the body. That is the most basic level. But beyond that, the soul means the powers that we have, the intellectual powers, and also the passions that we have. So our intellect and our passions, the things that really constitute our consciousness and the powers of our mind, as well as the way that we react at the deepest level to things, our emotions, our passions. Okay, so I'm not going to go beyond that for right now. I'm just going to say that Machiavelli dismisses this because he wants to reduce, not because he denies we have a mind or that we have passions, but because Machiavelli is dismissing the classical notion of the soul, because the classical notion of the soul is connected to objective goods. Just like the body has objective needs, if I drink water, that's healthy. If I drink gasoline, that's going to hurt me. It's not a choice I have. It's the way it is, right? The same thing with the soul in classical thought. The soul has needs that must be satisfied, as Tocqueville puts it. If you give the soul the right things, it's good for you. If you give the soul the wrong things, it's bad for you. And it's not subjective, it's objective. It is the way it is. So if you put, trash into your mind, it's going to corrupt your mind. If you cultivate the wrong passions, it's going to mess up your soul. So we'll get a lot deeper into that through this course, but this is really where we start digging into this a little bit, because Tocqueville is introducing this here and saying this is the problem with materialism, is that it doesn't address the needs of the soul. And whatever care you take to distract the soul from itself, it soon grows bored, restless, and agitated amid the enjoyments of the senses. So this is crucial. You cannot satisfy the soul through the body. Or maybe you can, but only in the most superficial way. You can distract the soul through the body, but you can't really satisfy it. And this is, in a nutshell, is Tocqueville's analysis of modern society and why it does not necessarily lead to human happiness, that we have all this prosperity and everything and freedom, because the simple reason that we have souls that have needs, but we don't necessarily know that. And if we're lacking the self-knowledge, we're lacking the knowledge of what we need, then we're dissatisfied, but we don't know why we're dissatisfied. And so we go after things to try to look for satisfaction. And in particular, we look for more material goods. Okay, I have these material goods that aren't satisfying me. I'll get more. That will satisfy me. But no, the reason I'm not satisfied is not because I don't have enough material goods. It's because I'm not satisfying my soul. But I don't realize that. So I keep trying to feed my soul through my body. But my soul can't be fed through my body. My soul has to be fed Soul has to be fed soul food. So, what is that? We're gonna look into that. But again, this is the problem. We don't know the soul. We don't know we have a soul, or we don't think too much about what the soul is. We're not able to satisfy it, and then we just end up being messed up. And even when we try to satisfy the soul, we're doing it in a haphazard kind of way that doesn't really work too well. So his final thought in this chapter: if the social state, circumstances, and laws did not so narrowly confine the American spirit to the pursuit of well-being, meaning material well-being, it is to be believed that when the American spirit came to occupy itself with non-material things, it would show more reserve and more experience, and that it would control itself without difficulty. But it feels imprisoned within the limits beyond which it seems it is not allowed to go. As soon as it crosses those limits, it does not know where to settle down, and it often runs without stopping beyond the bounds of common sense. So we already saw that. It's, the soul has to satisfy the soul. In other words, the first thing he's saying here is it's got to be done in a regular manner. It's got to be done with intelligence and knowledge and experience, and not in a haphazard way, which means really you need to have more of a cultural kind of approach. You can't just let people randomly try to figure out what they're dissatisfied about and what to do. You need to have more of an institutional approach, which, when the institutions are focused on money and wealth and everything, that becomes a problem. So before we get into the solution, which we're going to look at next time, we'll look a little bit here in the next chapter, why the Americans appear so restless amid their well-being. Tocqueville comes back to the critique of this doesn't really make us happy, and he adds some further detail into this. The man who has confined his heart solely to the pursuit of the goods of this world is always in a hurry, for he has only a limited time to find them, to take hold of them, and to enjoy them. So we all know, we saw this with Hobbes, right? We have desire after desire ending in death. We all know it's going to end at some point. We're not going to be able to get more stuff and enjoy more stuff. There's a time limit. So if that's our focus, we're always going to have to be in a hurry because it's going to end. The memory of the brevity of life goads him constantly. Apart from the goods that he possesses, at every instant he imagines 1,000 others that death will prevent him from tasting if he does not hurry. There's an endless series of material goods that we could have, that we could acquire, and no lifetime would be long enough to get them all. So if that's our focus, it's an endless focus, right? This thought fills him with uneasiness, fears, and regrets, and keeps his soul in a kind of constant trepidation that leads him to change plans and places at every moment. So Tocqueville, he explains the turmoil of American society in part by this, is that people are seeking a happiness which they're never going to achieve by the means that they're using. So going back to the contrast with aristocratic society, again, there's a great element of justice and freedom in modern society, but Tocqueville also looks at the flip side of that too. He's not denying that, but he wants to call attention to the other side of it. When all the prerogatives of birth and fortune are destroyed, when all the professions are open to everyone, and when you can reach the summit of each one of them on your own, an immense and easy career seems to open before the ambition of men, and they readily imagine that they are called to great destinies. So when you know you're free to do anything with your life, you can dream big, you can have huge dreams. But this is the next step, Tocqueville says. For most people, that is an erroneous view that experience corrects every day. Is everybody going to be a millionaire? Is everybody going to be, president of the United States? Is everybody going to be whatever, fill in the blank that everybody wants to be? Obviously not. That can't happen. It's never going to happen. The same equality that allows each citizen to conceive vast hopes makes all citizens individually weak. They destroy the annoying privileges of a few of their fellows, that is the aristocrats, but they encounter the competition of all. Because guess what? Everybody has the same opportunities that I do. Everybody has the same huge dreams that I do. So instead of saying, I want to be like, these great aristocrats and everything, I'm free to do that now. Well, that isn't guaranteed to anybody anymore. And everybody's aiming at that. So when I apply for the job, everybody else applied for the same job, right? So that's, what, again, we saw it's going to go towards the bell curve. It's not going to go towards everybody's going to get everything they want, obviously. But psychologically, that becomes a great, great pressure, because you're starting with these infinite dreams and hopes, and then you're finding the reality is going to be a lot less than, for the vast majority of us, going to be a lot less than what we think. So he says, among democratic peoples, men easily gain a certain equality. They cannot attain the equality they desire. The latter retreats from them every day, but without ever hiding from their view, and by withdrawing, it draws them in pursuit. They constantly believe that they are about to grasp it, and it constantly escapes their grip. They see it close enough to know its charms. They do not come close enough to enjoy it, and they die before having fully savored its sweet pleasures. The immediate context here is in material goods and the acquisition of goods. And again, we imagine a sort of equality where everybody's going to be an aristocrat, everybody's going to be wealthy. Right? That can't really happen. So we get some of that, but we never get as much as what we really want. But just as a side note, this also applies to politics, which I think we're not going to get into at the moment too deep into that, but something to bear in mind, okay, in terms of political status and privileges and things like that. We're tearing down different kinds of, inequalities and privileges, but Tocqueville predicts it's never going to be enough, because we can always imagine a more equal society. We can always imagine a society in which any existing, differences are going to be gone. But there can never actually be such a society, because the functioning of society, as Thomas More had mentioned as well, is always going to depend upon people having different roles and different positions and different, possessions and things like that. So even in a so-called communist society, there's never been an actually communist society. There's always somebody owning and controlling things and regulating who can have what, no matter if they want to call it communism or say it's going towards communism or something. It never happens. And that applies, both in terms of personal wealth and as we're looking at now, but also in terms of pretty much any other thing in society, status marker that can be regulated in society. So the conclusion of this here for us in this episode, some complain in France that the number of suicides is growing. In America, suicide is rare, but we are assured that insanity is more common than anywhere else. So why is Tocqueville bringing this up? In Europe, you've got suicide. In America, you've got insanity. What's this all about? These are different symptoms of the same disease. And we've been looking at that disease, materialism, addiction to material things, which don't satisfy us. And in fact, they increase our dissatisfaction, because if we think that's where we're going to get happiness and we don't, then we're always going to need more, and it will never make us happy. So it's like any kind of drug or something like that. We think I just need some more of it and I'm going to be happy, but it's never going to make us happy. Americans do not kill themselves, however agitated they are, because religion forbids them to do so. As we'll see next time, Tocqueville notes that Americans are, for modern people, particularly religious. And so much like Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, he thinks, darn, I just can't kill myself because God forbids it. They might want to kill themselves, but they think, I'm afraid I might go to hell if I do that. And so that's how he explains why more French people are killing themselves than Americans in the 1830s, right? But he says among them, the Americans, materialism does not, so to speak, exist. That is, philosophical materialism. They believe in an afterlife. Even though they're focused on material goods in this life, they still believe in an afterlife. And so they're afraid of losing that if they commit suicide. Although the passion for material well-being is general. Their will resists, but often their reason gives way. So if we're trying to do the impossible, it's not going to work, right? If we're trying to be happy through material things, Tocqueville says this is impossible. It doesn't fit our nature. Our nature is more than just material. It has a spiritual component. So if we're trying to do the impossible, we're banging our head on the wall, we're going to hurt ourselves one way or the other. Whether it's going to be suicide, whether it's going to be madness, whether it's going to be, leading to drug addiction, or it's, deaths of despair is the term that you hear nowadays, which are huge in our country right now. So this is very important. It's something that I think we should all be, concerned about as a reality, an objective reality. And this is Tocqueville's explanation of it, is because we have souls and because we need to learn how to satisfy our souls. And our culture is not teaching us how to do that. And one reason for that, you can go back to Machiavelli's Prince, where Machiavelli deliberately gets rid of the soul and says it doesn't matter, it's imaginary. It doesn't need to be dealt with. It doesn't need to be part of our culture anymore. And Tocqueville is trying to bring it back. So next time we will look in more depth at a positive model that Tocqueville is going to give for how you actually could understand and satisfy the needs of the soul.